Hello, hello, hello. Testing, testing. Is everyone here? Yes, there was an answer. Yes, yes, yes. We are here. Thank you for coming to the last of this lecture series. I'm quite sad that it's the last one, but I'm also very excited because I re-looked all of the sessions that had come before and I re-watched them, and I kind of thought I'd pull together a series of examples that fit our topic today and talk about that. But before we start, the usual story: you all need your paper, you all need your pens. So please take 1 or 2 or 3 papers. You can, and a pen if you mind passing on, and a color of your choice. Hello. And I brought some other special things along, and that's basically everything that we've done in our sessions so far. So, so you will recognize, for those of you that have been here, you'll recognize your old drawings from the first sessions, and you'll recognize some of this stuff. Yes? As many as you want. 2, 3, 1. So what's nice is I've collected everything, and now it's all on the floor. And as I said, after every session I go through what you give me. There we go. And I thought of just putting it into this wonderful box that I was given. Thank you for that box, by the way. And I thought I would, for the last session, just bring all this stuff here and actually have it as part of this last session, and see what we do at the end with what you're doing right now. If you want to add something, and obviously it's your material, so at the end of the session you can decide if there's anything of this that you want to take with you, that you want to use, that you want to keep, or whether we decide collectively to burn it as a ritual. Whatever we want to do, it's here. Anyway, so I just thought I'd lay it all out so that you know that it's waiting for you later. So, while we are getting things together, maybe this light is a bit bright here, because I see this is, can I maybe try this? I know you've just set your camera on my face. Is that okay? Yeah, I'll figure it out. You'll figure it out. Is that, you sure?
You can just try to put it lower.
Yeah? Would you prefer that? Would you prefer it to go lower? Okay. Let me turn it on again. It's just that there's a lot of dark videos that... Don't worry. I like the flashing, actually. Okay. Yeah, that's better. It's already better, whatever you did. Yeah? Is that right? Okay. So while we are warming ourselves up, you remember this? We're just going to play it again. And I've added right at the end this elements from our last session. So as a reminder, the sounds of our favorite place or an important place for us in your city. The line drawings are the pulse, the rhythm, the landscape, the setting. The little pieces of paper are our relationship to the territories and to the unknown and to the feelings that we have. These combinations are us in relation to the objects and the items and the narratives that we are unsure about. Again, our bodily relationship to that unknown space. And then the sets and the backdrops that you drew as collective maps, the mapping exercise of having a context and an exquisite corpus of places and ideas mixed with the little flags that represent something to you. And ending with your personal mind maps and your public mind maps, the one side being private, the other one being public, that you made as little masks last week. So that little journey so far has been an incredible 6 lectures of intensive feedback. As I said, I've taken each one of your little comments on board, tried to inform the next one, but what's really important for me is that you were part of the making. So it's no different today. Treat the lecture room as your studio. So this idea that we're talking today about the studio as being an important place, what does a studio mean? What is a studio to us as creatives? What I want you to do is, on the little piece of paper that you've got, look at the room around you. For 1 second, look at parts that you might have never looked at. Turn your heads, don't look at me, look somewhere else. Look at the corners, look at the lights, look at the fittings, look at the bars, look at the stains on the ceiling, look at the cupboards, the shelves, whatever you want to look at. Get a new perspective on the room. Take note of something that you've not seen before in this room. And relate something in the talk beyond these walls. So when you hear something that inspires you, that's interesting to you, look at the walls, think what's beyond the walls. Think of where the studio could be, where our space could be. Rearrange it in your mind. What if we could take all of these seats and build something out of it, and it became a big mountain of seats? What if we could swap around and I go sit at the back there and you all stand in front? Play with that in your mind. Have a little bit of an experiment in your mental journey. Take those mental journeys, note them on the little pieces of paper that you've got, and kind of create a little space for yourself. So you might want to fold it in half and create the corner of the room, which might be this corner. Draw on it, write on it, make a note. So just in your mind, while you're doing the lecture, have an idea, think about what your piece of paper could be and where it could go and what the notes on it could be. And right at the end, what I'd like to do is for all of us to jump up and place the piece of paper somewhere in the room with your notes on it and see what happens as a last experiment of this session. So this is just something for you to think about as I'm talking. You'll get some references and some notes to that as I'm going. Use it as your think space and your creative space. I'm not going to take these things with me afterwards. They'll be yours, but it'll be feedback at the same time that we'll have in the room. So, as per usual, the notes on the session. In today's talk, I'm going to be looking at the studio as an attitude, not as necessarily a physical space, but the question of studio as attitude and an approach. How do we as creatives approach the world through this idea of the studio, the space that holds us, and how do we approach the lived experience beyond the notion of what a studio is? Last week, I spoke about the value chain and this idea of how everything goes from beginning to feedback via production, etc., and how that value chain in the making of art and receiving of art and distributing of art and then the feedback of art has in it, at every step of the way, some relationship to the artist, and the idea of the studio is part of that, where we make, and how we relate that to the world around us. So in the session, I'm going to touch on that, and that's what I mean with the lived experience, not only of how we engage in the places around us, but actually how do we live our work in other spaces. And then how does the uncertainty of process, which we've discussed before, have an impact in the studio? And how do we search for language to translate this uncertainty into form? Now, this is something that we've touched on before, but I'd like to reiterate it again in the studio, especially as the studio is a space of vulnerability and a space of agency, these possibilities that are there when we give ourselves the space to play and engage. And then looking at how we can have a dialogue with oneself, with our medium, and with those that are in the room. So it's a kind of little summary to what we plan to do today. So to kick it off, I'd like to introduce you to a project called Hand Code. The reason why I'm going to bring that up is because I have a real fascination with those that make and those that document the world around. So we make by taking objects like you all are doing now with your pen and paper, and we're making and we're thinking and we do something. But then there are those that make through the lens, like someone sitting in this room with a lens focused on me. And there's something quite exciting about making by documenting, by capturing, by looking what's out there. And I was fortunate enough to be part of a project, and I'm going to take you for a moment into 2 spaces, one in Europe and one in West Africa, in Benin. And in Benin, there is a museum. In Paris, there's a museum called the Albert Kahn Museum. And Albert Kahn was a Parisian businessman a philanthropist also, who developed something called the Archive of the Planets. And the Archive of the Planets was his way of commissioning photographers and videographers to go out into the world and document the world and send the information back. He was trying to say, how can we collectively make and shape an image of our world by looking at cultures that are not necessarily heard? And being exposed to this collection, I got really intrigued and inspired by, in the 30s, the 1930s, various photographers, specifically Francis Opierre and Frédéric Gadmer, going into different parts of Benin and documenting life, ritual cultures of voodoo and other religious ceremonies within the region. But one of the things that they were documenting in that process and in that space were makers, crafters, people that were actually making at the time. And my obsession with looking at makers is that I'm really interested in when do we make and why we make. And I think we forget very often that the very important process of making is not to make art for the sake of art, but actually for the sake of self-reflecting, for the sake of making sense of the medium, for the sake of understanding what the form could be when we think in form, when we think in mark making, when we think in frame, instead of only thinking in the language that we are taught at school or in any institution. How can we break out of that? And so what was very interesting to me looking at the archive in the Albert Kahn Museum and picking up on some of these is what is the relationship between the maker and their medium and their context. I then had the fortunate opportunity a few months ago to go to Benin and actually travel along the photographer's route to try and find the different places where Albert Kahn Museum has archives from different people and see where these pictures were taken, who was met, what kings were represented, what voodoo ceremonies were shown, but more importantly to me personally was what is that relationship of technology then and now. And comparing the 1930s and what's happening now, it was a very interesting encounter that I came across. And one of the things that I was particularly interested in is that in all of this archive, very rarely the photographer was shown. And again, this comes back to the medium of holding on the information. But here in this little film that was made by Opierre and Gadmer in Benin, you have a crafter. This is a silent film, so there's no sound to it, obviously, who's currently using heat to engrave on a calabash, which is a bowl made of fruit. And on that calabash, he's engraving a shape. And you can see by the shape, which is so interesting, it's the tripod of the photographer photographing the person he's filming. So this is the only portrait I found in the whole collection of this Benin trip where the photographer, where the artist who's documenting the world is currently being captured by another artist. So this dialogue between two creative people encountering each other. And here we've got this crafter who is anonymous to us, other than we know he's able to burn images into this calabash, drawing the photographer who's always been anonymous in these works. And for me that triggered something quite interesting, that when we look at this world of craft and art making, forget that we are voyeurs just like we're being watched and sculpted. So very often I ask questions of how the colonializers were represented in a lot of the works that we see in West Africa, or generally in the colonized context, how these are represented. But very rarely have I found the direct reflection on the artists themselves, or the documenters for that matter. And so while I've found a lot of these mediums and a lot of these images of the past, going back to Benin and looking at practices where traditional tools and methodologies that were used a long time ago are being replaced with more contemporary ones, and my collaboration and my reflection with these crafters has very often been trying to document and create drawings collectively with them, taking old traditions, old practices, and thinking about how they can be applied today and how they are being applied today. And what's really interesting is that there's no difference between the need to make then to what there is now. The way of making is still the same. The villages still exist based on the ceramics, based on the boat making, based on the sewing, based on the clothes making. People are still in the process of collectively making and shaping. The tools might be slightly different, the materials might be slightly different, but the need to make is still the same. And so I thought it was very interesting, especially in a place that is not overrun by tourists, where everything is made as a souvenir. These are functional objects that are made for the people that are there. How making is an integral part of something that we do as creatives, and where we embed knowledge into the objects that we make. So each one of you have made something in this pile here that has your signature on it, not just in the mark that you made, but the fact that you've infused the material with something that is really valuable. You've infused it with something that you cannot extract from the material anymore. And so in that sense, what becomes really exciting is when you start to celebrate that and look at it in a completely new way. So I did with each one of these crafters and makers that you see, these artists with their hands, that I'm putting code into the materials that they use. I did experimental projects. So Mr. Sylvian, who unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago, I only heard recently, was an incredible collaborator who did a drawing with me using his sewing machine in Porto Novo in Benin. And then one night, just for the fun of it, I asked someone if I could borrow the projector, and we quickly plugged it in. We saw what would happen if we project his sewing onto his little shop, which is a tiny little shop on the side of the road, on a dusty road, where he sits inside his shop or outside his shop sewing people's shirts and clothes, etc., and making. And while he was busy making, we projected what was inside the shop on the outside, kind of exposing that which he makes. And what is really interesting is what the impact that it made on the community around, and how we then turned that whole space around into this creative studio for play. And so the studio process was me not being able to speak the language that was there. I mean, the bit of French that I know didn't help me, but it was about trying to expose some of the craft and skills of the artists that are there. And that exchange became a really interesting one because the community got involved and he was really celebrated. Very sad that he's not around. He saw the pictures, but wanted to go back and continue the project. But we will take it on to someone else next and see if we can extend this way of thinking. But with each craft and with each artist in Benin, it was about why do you make, how do you make, what is it, how do we expose it? And it's an ongoing research project that's currently happening. So hand code is a way of thinking about how we as artists encode that which we make with information from the past and with ritual. And talking about ritual, I'm going to skim through this a little bit. One thing I was really intrigued about, we always consider the act of making as artists as being something that is crafted, sculpted, made out of skill and need in the process of having learned something that gives us a unique skill. But what I was really intrigued about, I was staying in Benin in a small little old carver's village, and every morning I would see someone sweeping the floor. And I realized that this act of sweeping, the act of cleaning, the act of trying to organize nature was a really interesting concept for me. And so I asked the master sweeper, who you have here, to teach me. So every morning I got up, and for an hour and a half we would sweep together. He was very happy because he got a free helper. But it was a really interesting ritual of trying to understand what is it that every morning this carver, who also carves during the day, actually goes through the process of sweeping and sorting out the context with which he lives. And so this idea of organizing, sweeping, drawing on a very large scale was really interesting. I realized very quickly that the surface I was sweeping every morning became the studio space in which I could work. Until on the last day, I actually realized I have to take it the next step. And I have to think about what this act of sweeping really means. So the last day I had the sweep all to myself, and I really reflected on the big drawing that I'd made on this beautiful scale. And I realized I wasn't doing it for any other reason but to get rid of the leaves that were lying on the floor. But in doing that, the ritual of making became a really interesting thing. And I think we forget about that process that we do every day. People make art about brushing their teeth because it's what we do every day automatically. We watch these cooking shows about people making amazing meals and say, oh, there's incredible chefs that are inspired and everything else. We all cook every day. And so you starting to realize that the ritual of making, the moment you put a mark to it and you frame it in a different way, becomes something really valuable. So here you see me putting ink onto my broom and then painting on a big cloth or a sheet actually from the place where I was staying, and because there's not much material around, so I had to just use what I could. And then you see me just drawing with whatever ink I had to create some copy or reference some of the things that are around. But it's within this kind of strange environment that the studio grabs you and makes you realize that the everyday ritual is part of something that could be an attitude towards the lived experience and holding on to that. And so within this very strange carving village context, I suddenly made this drawing, which to this day, I've worn it once, but I'm not sure what to do with it otherwise. But similarly, we don't have to be as far as Benin to look at that. In every small town across Europe, you've got little museums and places that celebrate the act of making in different ways. The ritual of every day that is used, whether it's the ploughing of the field, whether it's the fixing of the shoes, whatever it is in the act of making that becomes an interesting space to explore. So for example, here the Murau Handwerksmuseum, I spent quite a lot of time in Styria, in this museum, not for the sake of looking at the main exhibits, they're beautiful, but actually for going into the spaces where the objects are forgotten. So at the back of the museum, in the attic, there's a whole pile that's just pushed into the corner. And going through them and seeing elements that are used for shoe repair, for various things, I start realizing that all of these objects have got a history, have got a language that has been shaping them and that they've shaped in the world. And so getting to know these objects has been really interesting because they don't have labels next to them to say this was the plow from then and then from this and this farmer, but rather these are the objects that are unknown and we don't quite know what to do with them. And obviously, I then have fun with light and drawing to try and create little stories around them, which is my act and my way of making sense of them. But while sitting in this back storeroom drawing and playing with them, I start realizing that you know, if a farmer or if a cook or if a seamstress or whatever spend time with this object and has given this object value and we place it into a new space, how can I give thanks to that? How can I acknowledge that? And how can we as artists start acknowledging the history that these drawings have that you've made, for example, as part of the dialogue that I would like to have with them? And how do they start representing not only the objects that they are, but the space that they come from? So an artwork relates to its studio. An artwork comes from somewhere. You can make an artwork in a vacuum and pretend that that's what it is. But actually, the moment you know that this little piece of paper was in this room during this and this lecture, and someone actually drew this for whatever reason they drew it, it starts to create a different meaning behind it. Some meaning is more potent than others because some things we can all relate to, hunger, war, etc. Other objects are maybe more abstract like this because no one else was in this lecture, so no one really knows what this is about. But that's good because it means there's some mystery behind it and the unknown. And so I'm like with the projection on the small shop with Mr. Sylvain. Here I take some of the traditions of making, for example, and I project it back on the outside of the building to say how do we expose that which is made, that which is hidden away, that which is on the inside of the building, and actually make the whole building and the environment that. So this used to be a place where this object was made. How do we bring that forward and actually talk about how important the context and the space is in relation to the object that was made there? So imagine this whole building being wrapped, this whole school or this whole classroom being wrapped in tiny little orange pieces of paper to say this is where this paper is from, in order to make us aware of that relationship. So sticking with this idea of the museum as a host for some of these things, when I moved to Vienna just before the pandemic from South Africa, I didn't have a studio. Very frustrating idea. Where do I make art? You know, I'm used to having space where I can make a mess like this. But what do you do? How do you find a room or a space to make something? And it's nice to be in your bedroom, but you know, it's only this big. And so when you're used to thinking differently, and the pandemic was there, so we always had to hide behind things, etc. But in the gap of the pandemic, somehow there was a moment where I didn't have to be on Zoom, but I could go out and do something. And I met with Khadija, who's an artist in Vienna, who had a similar thing because she'd just moved from Australia. And I said, well, let's meet in the museum and let's make the museum our studio. Especially because there was an exhibition on in the Weltmuseum, which is a museum of ethnography, which was about the Aztecs and the story of the Aztecs. And so we had this idea of wanting to respond to this, especially with all the objects that are supposed to go back to Mexico, which the Austrians are not giving back because they want to hold on to their treasures, because that's what's important to us, because that's how we make money. So we said, well, how can we play in the studio and make art about the subject without having a studio? Well, let's go straight into the museum. So in the museum, no one stopped us. All the guards were just watching what we were doing. We started to do things like make new labels. So here, for example, you can see the story of Mexico and the history from whenever into the contemporary times, 2019 being the last post. And then we put there one saying, 2025, return the objects to Mexico, in terms of the journey of objects that would be done. We interacted with other objects in the museum, making new labels until the audience actually came. So just because they had iPad labels or like screen labels, so we made our own. And we just placed it down and watched how people were interacting with it. We started to play with little projections. We had a little handheld projector, and we just projected the visa for this object behind the object, because everyone needs a visa to be there. So a Schengen visa for the object would be quite nice. So we quickly photoshopped right there, and on the iPad a little visa for the object. This was an idea we had in the museum. We were standing there going, let's do that. And we had the little projector. We projected, took a photo, and went on to the next thing. And so this idea of playing in the museum was a really exciting space where, I won't go into each object, but where the dialogue with the objects became really interesting. And I realized that we consider museums as spaces to look, not to make. We consider these exhibits as being truths and not questions. And so is the studio approach to a museum not a way of questioning the museum itself? Is it not a way of looking at how you're being watched by the cameras in the museum all the time as how you're behaving in the museum? How do I behave in my studio? I can take my clothes off and jump around and sing. I can't do that in the museum. But if we start flipping this idea of what a museum versus what a studio is on its head, maybe there are moments where we can challenge not only the museum itself, but the audience and how the audience interacts with objects. So a beautiful moment was when the audience came to me and asked me why I'm taking pictures in the way that I am, why I'm playing with a reflection. The audience came and they said, that label, what does it mean? Because it said something on it. And that was really interesting, because suddenly I was being playfully active, but someone was responding to it. I'm not going to talk about each one of these, but you can start seeing the kind of games that we were playing in the museum as a playful thing. And I can't believe we weren't kicked out. I mean, to this day, I'm amazed. But anyway, we did simple things, just playing with reflection. There's nothing, we're not intruding in, we're not damaging any of the work. We're just experimenting. So playing with other cultures and the meaning of other cultures obviously requires a lot of research, and luckily we were informed by a lot of the things we're talking about. But then there are moments where you have to just trust your relationship with other artists in a museum and see what in the studio, and see what happens. When you don't have a museum to tell you the story from a colonial point of view of the place that you don't know, but you want someone who's living in an area to tell you the story, the best way is to open up that relationship. So we're back in West Africa. This time we're in Senegal, in Dakar, and wow, that's loud. So while in a small space, a kind of a artist residency space, which provided an exhibition space for me and a studio to play in, I invited a chorus singer and a performer to come and join me in the space and play. And what was very interesting is we didn't agree on anything beforehand, other than that we were interested in notions of China, notions of capitalism, and notions of creative speaking to each other in a new language. So how can the studio of three very different disciplines, a visual artist, a performing artist, and a musician, come together in trying to make sense of each other's worlds, especially when one of them is definitely from a completely different context. And so what you see here, and I'm jumping through it because it's a long video, and I'll post it or the link to it later. You can see, I'm feeling very uncomfortable because I actually don't know what to do while Fatou is running around and performing like crazy, and Lamine is singing his heart out. And slowly but surely we find each other and we actually get into quite a violent fight. And I thought that was really interesting that Fatou considered me as invading her space, which was the studio that she wanted to perform in. And I was bothered because she wasn't paying me any attention in my studio. And so the two studios were in a conflict with each other until eventually I got so upset with all these lights that I'd put there from China that I went to start to destroy them. And as I was destroying them, saying, okay, you're in my studio now, I realized that actually she was holding onto the lights. And it's insane when I watch it now. I'm busy stabbing her with this pole. And I think, wow, looking at it afterwards, like what happened in that moment where two artists are fighting for each other's attention and at the same time for each other's space. And I'm not this kind of person. This is a complete transformation of me as a body. And very different to the museum experience. This was, yeah. And Lamine watching us going, okay, I better play some music now. And the sounds that you're hearing are the Chinese toys making that kind of layered noise. If I tell you it was about 6 hours of play. We were in that space for 6 solid hours, just playing and exploring. And as you see, it got quite violent at parts. Other parts, we just ignored each other. Other parts, we chased each other around. At this point, which was quite fun, I started to shove the lights into Fatou's outfit. This was pretty funny. And so she was this kind of walking Michelin man of light, kind of walking around trying to make sense of. Oops, so sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, this is the same person as you showed, I don't know when.
Say again?
Did you show some collective performance with other artists in your studio where you are painting together, the big, from just two sides, like touching one?
Oh, no, this wasn't the same artist. No, this is a different artist. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So this isn't a different artist. I want to just get to a point of it. I always struggle with this controls here. Pardon. We will get there. So what was interesting is I'd never met Fatou before. So it was also this idea of meeting someone completely new that had not been in that journey before with me. So the energy was very different to Ngoli, because with Ngoli, who you're talking about now, that I presented, I think, one of the first lectures, there was a direct relationship with him because I had questions about our contexts collectively, he had questions about me, and we explored this. In this case, Fatou and I met on completely different basis, where they were, and same with Lamine, the kora player. Interestingly enough, the relationship between us also eventually faded into something where they just let me be. There was this kind of recognition that I need some more time to make sense of what just happened and I need to carry on drawing. And that's exactly what happened. And all that Lamine was doing in the background was singing and playing, and I was trying to copy him. So there was also this idea that at some point someone gave over and let the other person have the studio. And it was a kind of strange tension between us. Which, I mean, afterwards we spoke about it, and it was a very kind of emotional relationship. Slightly different way, same city. I wanted to show you this because it was in the same city, and the studio was very different. The studio in this case is a building, and a building that is being torn down by a developer, but lived in and fixed by the people that are living in it. Strange space, this unknown building in Dakar. which is planned for demolition. It still stands. This was about 10 years ago. The building is still there. It hasn't been demolished. But inside there were questions about what could happen to this building. And the students from the École des Beaux-Arts in Dakar were working with us, and we used it as a studio to reflect on what the building could be. So it was kind of an urban planning project where we said, how can we transform the building from the outside? Again, working with a form of projection. Stephen Hobbs and myself as collaborators worked with the students and then made this very temporary, very quick piece that was about participating and talking to the building rather than to another person. So for about a few weeks, we investigated the surroundings. We played with different simple animation styles, like taking pieces of paper and tearing it and making stop frame animations, and eventually thought about how can we activate this building through shadows, through little lights, through torches, and how can we just use it as a stage, but also see if a building can be a collaborator, a dialogue partner, and how we can draw attention to it. So it became not only the object of inspiration, not only the studio, but also the collaborator to a certain extent. So it was a really exciting way of thinking about an object in a completely new way, and allowing different people to tell different stories about the object in their own way, and seeing what happens when it's a surface to play with. And that idea of the studio being three-dimensional, being an object, brings me back to this idea of where we're sitting, this idea that there is a physical space. So as I said before, when I looked at the museum and I used it as a studio out of desperation, I didn't have another place to play. But then finally, after having this beautiful studio in Johannesburg, I just love showing the picture because it was my home for so long, to just make art in a big scale and have fun. And then moving to Vienna and being in my little apartment, locked down and not having a space, eventually, beginning of this year, I get a new studio. I'm so excited. I'm in Vienna. I've got this beautiful white cube space, and I'm going, yes, now I can make art. And there you see me making art, very proud in my studio to draw. My first drawings, very important moment. And kind of this idea of this obsession with a space as being the thing that holds creativity is such a bizarre thing. Because immediately you think differently, immediately you shape differently, immediately you collect differently because you've got somewhere to put things, and your partner at home isn't telling you not to put your stuff on the lounge table. Immediately you've got a different way of thinking about the objects that inspire you, you surround yourself by it. But for me, what was really interesting is that because I've spent so much time not wanting to be in the studio and being in the museum, being in a public space, being in foreign lands like Dakar and Benin and everything else, my relationship to the studio also changed. And I had an exhibition many years ago in Vienna with drawings. I might have shown some of these drawings before in one of the talks, of objects from Syria that were destroyed, and the Syrian landscape that was destroyed in Aleppo, and the refugees I was working with giving me visions of these places and me painting them. This is a very big, it's like double the size of the screen painting, for example. And I had forgotten about them in the sense that I gave them to a friend to keep, because, you know, flying them to South Africa is expensive. And, you know, I don't need to always hold on to everything I make. And so I said to my friend, do you want to keep them? But now that I've got a studio in Vienna, he knocks on my door and he says, have your shit back. And he gives me these rolls of canvases. And I'm like, okay, now I've got a space to store it. So let me, and I open them up and I realize this is an incredible new way to work. What if I recycle this work? So suddenly now the object in the studio becomes more interesting, because coming back to your question earlier, Molly is on his way to come visit me in Vienna. Remember that piece where I was fighting with Molly through the screen? Now suddenly he's sitting in my studio in Vienna, where he was in Johannesburg before, and his body is completely recontextualized. It's kind of relocated, and it's transformed my studio into a place of home. It was an amazing experience to have my old work that I then nailed onto the wall quickly, and him in the space, and us starting to play together in this area. And so suddenly something happened in understanding that the studio is actually a space for hosting experiments, for playing. And that this little corner that I created was the home for play and experimentation. And so what you see here are just some images of how this corner has transformed through thinking in 3 dimensions. So where it was a flat wall before, it's now become a multi-layered, projected, drawn, sculpted, assembled, destroyed, reassembled play space, where I have dialogues with other artists, where I have dialogues with scientists, where I have dialogues with myself, where I have dialogues with robots that I made. So there's this kind of ongoing engagement and encounter. And then suddenly my partner, who's sharing the studio with me, comes and projects her work right next to mine. And, you know, something happens. And it's this idea of the collective process, creating your little space, but then knowing that you share a studio with someone else, and how these things rub up against each other, and how important that friction is. How important it is for another work to look at your work. Even though this video has got nothing to do with mine, it becomes about that dialogue. And I think that our studio cannot exist in a vortex. It would be nice sometimes, because you don't want the outside world to bother you, but very often it's because you invite people into it that things work. And so there's a PhD student who's currently in Pretoria working on something about my work, and he wants to interview me. So he came from South Africa to Vienna and spent some time with me, and instead of doing an interview, we did this. We decided to forage for things both in the city and in my studio and in South Africa, bring them to Vienna, and actually collectively make a work where he reads, where we play, we experiment, and we actually build an installation as part of his PhD research that he then reflects on the making of. And that was for me a really interesting thing, that maybe if you come into my studio, you have to go by my language rather than asking me verbal questions. What happens if I only answer you by doing? What happens when we use our strengths that we have and we don't abide by the rules of others? It's something quite important when we say our studio has an attitude, our studio has an approach, our studio holds something that is very important to us. And how do we prevent that from being destroyed by forces that we don't want to have infused in our space? So there you've got a wider view of what happened in that corner, and then the discussion afterwards, which is very complex and bizarre, because to talk about the process afterwards doesn't always work. That's why there's no audio to this piece, because none of it made sense. But it was a very interesting experiment. And you know, while the end product looks interesting to some extent and shows process, it was destroyed the next day. It was gone because it had to make way for something else. And so there's this ongoing question of what happens when strangers come into your space, because as artists we go into public space, we invade it, as I showed you with previous examples, we do things in public space and we activate the dialogue in public space. But what if we allow the public into our studio to participate and play? And that's what happened. I'm just showing you a few examples of what happened recently with a group of anthropology, art, curator students from the University in Vienna coming in and exploring ideas around what it means to be and explore a studio and the devastation that happens afterwards. Not different to what we were doing in the studio together here in Ústí. So 2 of you are here in this. Raise your hands. So we were fortunate enough to have a series of sessions together where we also played and we also shared a studio. And we're calling these traces of a process because the whole idea was to create moments of engagement where there's not one artist that says this is how it's going to be, but where there's a holding and supporting of each other. And each moment is a moment of encounter, a moment of play, a moment of collectively doing something. And what happens when we collectively play and do and allow ourselves to explore? We start opening up wounds that we didn't know we had. We start acknowledging good things that we didn't know were good. We start breaking the boundaries of those things which we are told not to break because we either soar in our heads and we don't want to share it with anyone, or because it's taboo to be doing it in public. So in the studio, when you trust each other and when you hold each other and when you support each other, the most amazing things happen. And Michael, as you pointed out, sometimes we don't need to talk about what it is or what it means, but just allow the work to be just like we allow the process to happen. And the marks that we make, the traces that we make are all part of that. So I'm just going to skim through some of these to show you, they're all sitting on YouTube now, this journey that we're on where we just highlighted certain moments and the traces and the marks that were made. And just saying there are a few clues. This isn't a final artwork. It's just giving evidence of something that we went through. I do want to show this one. I think this is really important. In that journey, which gets really exciting, is when Al, you arrived in the session and you had pieces of lino and we had to tear them once we found a random public space that you took us to. Kind of just went there. No one quite knows where that is. And we started to rub the pieces of lino against surfaces, each one of us. There were 4 of us. And then you went back to the studio and you printed them and you made these beautiful works that we now have. Each one of us has one as part of this. So these are rubbings of a place that we made together that you then printed in your studio and brought back. So my question there, where is the studio? Does it matter? It's about that transaction. It's about the interaction. It's about the blurring of those boundaries of who's doing what, where, and when. So this particular one I let run now because I think there's a really important moment where we want to push the studio wall. I mean, I often go through that. I kind of want to get rid of that studio wall and break through it, but at the same time I need something to hold me and make sure that I can still play in that space. And what was amazing sharing that with others and collaborators was I felt that tension in such a beautiful way. And for me, these little traces, these little moments, these little reflections that you see going here are ways of holding on to that without, as I said before, them becoming artworks per se, but just expressing moments that happen on that journey. Yeah. I don't want to say too much more about it. The studio being indoors, outdoors, with projection, without projection, mark making in a way, but then also just moments of complete and pure bliss. So sitting in that space, the bliss that I'm talking about is the ability to feel the emotion that is needed to access your own process and that of the others around you. We spoke about death, we spoke about life, we spoke about harm, we spoke about comfort, we spoke about so many different things, but it really came through in the collective process in the studio. And then it was glorified on the projection surface outside the House of Art for the opening of the last exhibition, which was a really beautiful way of acknowledging it. And it was really nice because it was cold outside, and if you really wanted to see it, you would stand outside and freeze while you're watching it, so you had to suffer for seeing the art. But what was very nice for me, it again wasn't a final artwork or a final product, but snippets and moments of something that is fleetingly put onto the facade and then gone. It's not meant to be anything more than that. And I think that's what's so amazing about the studio, is that it's about making that which is intangible. It's about something resonating beyond that which we do now, that isn't necessarily of solid form, but the trust in that relationship with something that will have an impact later. It's like dropping that thing in the water and having the ripple effect, that cliche of the ripples. You know that the ripple is going to disappear eventually, but you need to do it anyway in order to feel like you're going through something. And so this idea of resonance has been a really important one. And I had the fortunate situation of having a group of really talented performers and musicians and visual artists in my studio and playing in Johannesburg, where we literally looked at what happens when you just allow people's voices, their issues, their stories to unfold without rehearsing it, and having hours of play that become physical statements in a space where projection meets performance meets sound. And I'm going to play you just a few clips of that. So, for me, it's exceptionally inspiring when people from such diverse backgrounds, with such political kind of complexities and histories and different disciplines can come together and do something like that. This is unrehearsed. This is raw. I mean, the photographer started singing. You know, he was busy taking pictures of everything. The next thing you see him singing because he believes in this thing that grabbed him, and he just participated. And there's something that gives me goosebumps today still when I watch this, and I understand the power that a space like that can hold, where people feel safe and held. And I kind of want to always challenge any politician to say, come into my studio, so let's play and see what happens next. Yeah, there must be ways and conditions in which we could do that. I want to share one more, much more intimate moment with you on a similar basis as the one that you just saw, but with a different kind of relationship. So the Center for the Less Good Idea, based in Johannesburg, has built what they call a Pepper's Ghost, which is an 18th century theater device for creating ghosts on stage. You know, kind of, it's a mirror type of effect. In this case, there's a mirror, a 50% mirror in front of the performer, and there's a control of light on both sides. And because of the control of lights, you can double layer an image. So when you look at it, you actually think there are two pictures layered on top of each other in a clever way. And so what's happening, there's a projection on it, which the performer can see also on the floor, so they can see the projection. But it then creates this layered effect. And so while Mika, who's an incredible percussionist, is busy having a dialogue with a robot that I built many years ago. This was last month. He is having a dialogue with an object, and the object is responding and not responding. But more importantly, during that dialogue, we're busy drawing live with a drawing tool on top of him to interact with him. So this artist collective, myself, are sitting on the iPads busy drawing as he's performing. And I just want to show you this because it's a very much another take on playing in the studio as an experiment. This was never meant to become anything other than us getting to know each other. Anyway, and him getting to know the machine, Mika getting to know the robot. They'd never met before this moment. The people that you hear clapping is the production crew. That's how many people it takes to make this work. So it's that kind of very personal space that he was occupying, that we were witnessing and then trying to contribute to. And I kind of felt, for me, in terms of the talking of a studio and a space for activation, that was a really important thing I experienced in the last month, where it's a space one has to respect, a distance one has to respect towards the other one producing. And at the same time, you want to be part of it. You want to share that emotion. You want to join in, or you want to give advice. And it's an interesting tension. And so I'm still processing this somehow. And between that and the work we did here in Ústí in terms of these traces and things, there's something quite valuable that's brewing in terms of thinking about studio and how do you think through the process of the studio. And in true finishing style, I want to show you a little moment where the studio becomes something completely new. This is me packing up part of my studio in Johannesburg. So these two performers who preferred to stay nameless were not performers, they were trolley pushers, which is in South Africa a very important job, I'd say. That's how they make their money. They take objects, they sell them to the recyclers, that's how they make money. But without them, the whole system would crumble because there's no one else taking care of the rubbish the way they are. It's a really important component to the economy of trash that exists within the Johannesburg context. And the two anonymous, because they don't want to be named, participants here wanted to just come and get the trash so that they could burn it, because it's wood. You saw it's paper and wood. They can make fire of it, or they can sell the plastic, etc. They just wanted to come into the studio and get what they can get. And suddenly I asked them if I could film them as part of cleaning up, and they said yes, no problem, but I mustn't mention their names. But it was interesting to me that now suddenly my studio was being packed away. And for those of you that were in the lecture last week, you would recognize those little blocks where I spoke about the aspiration blocks that we set on top of each other in terms of building towers towards something as artists that we try to achieve. These like monuments to something unattainable that we as artists always want to get up there. Here, these are the very same blocks that are being thrown away and taken around the corner to be trash and recycled and maybe burnt. And so the very raw material as an artist that is so important in the studio and making the next film and making the next artwork is another person's fuel to stay warm. And for me, that really does a different spin on things when you think about public art, for example, where objects in public space are sometimes worth more their material value than they are their cultural value. It's worth more to steal the metal sculpture, to sell it to the scrapyard, than it is to acknowledge it as a sculpture, because at the end of the day, you need to eat. And so my personal struggle as an artist is sitting between the studio in which I create, the objects that I'm proud of, the things that I want to present to you, and at the same time, the challenges that exist within this kind of unknown mountain of personal challenges, concerns, desperation, meta-crisis that exists around, and how some of the material that is so important for me to make a statement becomes something completely different for someone else. And this moment for me was a really important one in my packing on the studio in Johannesburg, because I had to let go of so many things that defined what my studio was. Those little blocks defined something about me as an artist in the making of sculpture, because somehow they were recycled so many times and used in so many different pieces. And now suddenly they become fuel for fire. And I need to acknowledge that, I have to accept that. And that's what's so beautiful about being vulnerable in the studio, that whatever we make is not permanent. It's always temporary. As are those things that you made. They were not meant to be permanent. They're meant to be temporary. They're meant to be moments for you to reflect. They're meant to be moments for us to experiment and play with. And yeah, if you have your objects that you've currently made in the studio, I'd love to see them. If you have anything that you've got with you now, the little orange papers. If you don't, that's fine. But I actually wouldn't mind for a few minutes turning this space into a bit of a studio, to kind of acknowledge its four walls, acknowledge what's beyond it, and see if we can maybe share something that's not you just sitting in the seat and me standing in front. So do you have any, well, not do you have, I'm going to ask you all to get up with your little drawings and place them somewhere in the room, or hold them somewhere in the room, and just see what happens. Please. May I comment on this? Can I say something? Yeah. So I just walked here and suddenly a piece was dropped behind, which is so nice. It's almost like an invisible trace that's left behind here. And it says, I managed to draw. I think it's so beautiful. Just like this acknowledgement that something happened. Say no more. It's just a nice moment. So go around and explore each other's things if you like. I'm just enjoying sitting here for a change. That's good. And for those of you that want to take anything with you from the last sessions, it's all in front there. It's all mangled and mixed, so feel free to scratch through it. If you want a memento from the sessions, feel free to take them. Otherwise, they'll go back into their little box and they will be relocated to a studio somewhere for future use. Seriously suits you.
Oh,
You've got a good head shape. Yeah. You know, some people, when they do it, looks terrible. You've got a good head shape.
Like an egg or marble.
No, but it was my biggest fear when I did it, whether my head was going to be in a shape or not. I was like, oh God, no.
Yeah, I think you have nice shape.
So people with good shape head should show them off.
I can't get it anywhere else because it's the stickers of my notebooks.
Ah!
Sorry, it's here.
Perfect. Can I do exactly that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Perfect. You know there's the...
I see it. Yes, yeah.
Get it anywhere else. So. It's here.
And there's one here as well. Nice. Great. I'm loving the fact that we're feeling the space in a different way. Thank you. Thank you for indulging me to kind of break the mold of the space. Maybe we should have done this in the first lesson, not in the last one, because I really enjoyed sitting back there and I think I would have changed the structure. But I'd like to share with you that this has been a really valuable and beautiful process with all of you. So thank you for allowing me to share my journey over the last 7 lectures. I know people have come and gone, and it's been a different crowd every time in terms of some consistent faces, but others come and go. But I hope that you got something from this. I know the talks are all online, and I'm also going to be placing our collective video online as well, just to acknowledge that it was all part of that journey. I'm not quite sure what to do with these pieces now because they're so nicely tucked in here. And I don't know if you got nice photographs of some of the pieces. We can just add to the mix, because I think this is really interesting how the space exists. And I don't know, unless you want to take them with you, I'd almost suggest you leave them up and see what happens. So that next person that walks into this lecture room looks at this going, there's something strange going on here, and it's good, because it's not supposed to be lectures like this anymore. We're supposed to break that mold and become collective studio players. So I'm hoping that you got some of that feeling from today. Thank you. As I said, the stuff is here. If you don't take it, I'm going to keep it. So thanks to you. And thanks to the studio collaborators.